everybody, welcome back to the channel on our next episode of Infernal Intercourse with me and Pastor Brian. So this time we want to talk about various ideas of God. So I'm going to throw it over to Brian, the pastor, and see what he wants to talk about with different ideas of God. So Brian?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, when I watched this trailer the first time, the thing that kind of just struck me was this, what an original and refreshing idea it is in a certain way that they're going to make God retire, right? I mean, I thought, okay. But on the other hand, it kind of was like, that doesn't make sense with what has come before. But then I did think about, the whole movement that said God is dead, right? And then just a lot of scholastic theories that said, well, there was a prime mover who made everything, but then ceased to exist or retired, or that there's a disinterested God who just stays back from us, or maybe even a malevolent God, right? And I mean, I relate to that. God has a lot to answer for, in my opinion. And so those things came up when they humanized God the way they did in this trailer, and it looks like how they're going to do during this season.
Yeah, we'll have to see, because the whole idea that God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, that God has all these omnis, doesn't really make a lot of sense to begin with, right? Because if God is omniscient, there's no free will, right? Because God already knows what you're going to do. God can see every possible parameter of any possible choice you might make, right? And then if God is omnipotent, then why does hell exist, right? Because God would have known, because he's omniscient, that Satan would oppose him, or that the people would eat the fruit from the tree or whatever, and he would have known that was going to happen. And he could have easily avoided that by not having a tree, or not making angels, or whatever. So and the omnipresent thing doesn't make sense, because then God would be everywhere and know everything anyway. So there's really no way to make that square with a lot of the things that we think about when we think about Christianity, including hell and angels and free will. So God must not be those things, I guess. And does anyone really say, is there a reason why God has to be all good? I mean, a God within the eternal torture chamber, it really isn't good, right? In definition, a God who claims to love you and then throws most of the population into this eternal fire is not very loving. So, and a God who will invent people and then put a tree in the middle of a garden and say, hey, I haven't given you the knowledge of good and evil, and you don't really know anything. And you don't understand consequences, but don't eat from this tree over here. That's a whole gotcha, right? I mean, there's no way they're not going to eat from the tree. Come on.
Yeah.
None of these things really make sense. And of course, even in the story of that in Eden, God's walking through the forest and he can't find them, right? Because originally Yahweh is a much smaller God, right? He's more of a local Canaanite God and not the God of everything, omnipotent, right? So he's much more just bigger than people. The Greek gods were like humans writ large, but not omnipotent and omniscient. That seems to be what a lot of the Old Testament God is like that. Which
my God is better than your God. Yeah.
Yeah, because you could understand why that God might not know everything, and might not be in control of everything, and might have made mistakes. Maybe didn't really want to invent hell, and he did it, and it was like, oh, what do I do with this now? I don't know. But it doesn't square the whole omni kind of God.
Well, you're hitting on, the phrase as a pastor that I use all the time. And I say, would you worship that God, right? Would you worship a God who condemns human beings in this very difficult life to eternity? And it's not even just to some kind of a purgatory, right? Mm-hmm. But to eternity, that there's a complete decision, right? Now, I think we've discussed, you and I don't believe in that, but nonetheless, that is what most people present as Christianity. And that is the mythology that we have to draw on in the West, kind of ubiquitously. But I also often say, would you worship a God? And I know they don't touch on Jesus here, but we all know Christianity in this culture. And, I'll love you and forgive you after I become a son and live a poor life under oppression, under the empire, and then be tortured and die. Okay, now I can love you, right? That's not a God. right?
Right.
And so it's more realistic to think of God in this more human form, or to say there is no God, really. And, so that's why I thought of this. To me, you're kind of pulling back the curtain on the Oz. If you're going to go ahead and humanize God, okay, there's a good argument for that. But then, what is this series based on? That's what was interesting to me.
Yeah, because we have had a lot of this, God's going to be mad at you, God's going to, come, God is powerful. Although we've also been told by, I guess, Lucifer, when he was trying to tell Linda his life story, and he's like, well, Mom and Dad, I guess this is the God Johnson episode, and he's like, they banged or whatever, it was the Big Bang and everything, they create everything, but then God goes into the garage, basically, and disappears. And so I guess we're assuming that God's not been around for a very long time. He's fiddling with another universe, or he just took up a different hobby. We don't really know. But, he obviously had the outs with his wife. So she got banished to hell, and Lucifer got banished to hell. And I guess Michael's been trying to take over heaven, and God's been fiddling around in the shed out back. Yeah.
And that theory, like I said, that God is this, like God retired, or God walked away, or God doesn't care. I mean, that evolves in many periods of humanity, because again, this God has a lot to answer for. Even if you do believe in a God, and how do you call God good and look at the world? I mean, that is very hard. And so, yeah, maybe it's an easier way to look at God, to say, well, I don't know what God was, but God sure isn't Godding right now.
Mm-hmm.
But then the idea that, okay, that seems like they're competing to become God. And of course, that's a whole different ontology, theology than we don't have a context for that. That's kind of a new concept. I don't know of any theologies that talk about God being replaced by someone else. But.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. We did have at the end of season 4 where we learned that only an angel can rule hell. And that's because they have wings, and this throne is all high and looks over everything, so only an angel can fly up there. Okay. So that's part of the rules. But what are the angels doing in heaven? I mean, they're apparently not hanging around all the human souls, because they despise humans. So there must be like an angel ghetto of some kind, where they just sit there behind their own walls. They've walled it off, and they just hang out and do angel-y things, which is who knows what. And once in a while, God will say, hey, go to Earth and deliver this message. Like Amenadiel came down and made sure that Chloe could be born. Okay. But God's not omnipotent then? Or he couldn't have just snapped his fingers and made sure that Chloe's parents weren't infertile? I mean, that doesn't make much sense either.
Or is this change triggered by Lucifer, right? I've said all along that I think Lucifer is the God figure, whether they say it or not, but it is quite, I loved Joe God, right? Like, so that was, I liked that God, but, it's fascinating. I'm not too hard on him, I guess, about playing with theology, but it does get confusing, and I can see some interesting ways they can take this. And I just think it's neat. You don't hear conversations anymore, God is dead, in the U.S., right? And so I think that's probably a conversation we need to be having about what kind of God do we worship, and is there really a God? And I know that makes people gasp, especially for a Christian pastor to say, but there's just as much logic in that as any other theology or ontology that people talk about.
Yeah, because a lot of it, if you think about it too long, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. The whole blood sacrifice of Jesus, as you said, really doesn't make much sense. Hell doesn't make any sense. What could a human possibly do in one human lifetime to warrant an eternity of punishment? Punishment maybe, but eternity is not like 1,000 years or 1,000,000,000,000 years. It would be trillions of years.
Flagrant. Yeah. I mean, when God is so flagrantly violent, and you know what I mean? Like, there's just so much unbelievable trauma and suffering, even just the acts of God, even if you take away humans with their own free will that cause a lot of the suffering in the world, but still there's just a lot of suffering that's an act of God. So
right. Well, we mentioned before that, Saul displeases God by not being genocidal enough, right? I told you to kill all of those people and you spared some of them, right? You didn't kill enough people. So yeah, God has done interesting things in the Bible that we cannot really square with a good God.
I just like it made me think, because, I preach this because to me, if there's a God, God must be unconditionally loving, right, and caring. And when I talk about these suffering things, I say God leans near us, right? That's the idea of Jesus to me. But it really made me think about, really, do you have a right to talk about a loving God? But then if God's not loving, then is God worshipful? And I don't think God deserves to be worshiped if God's not loving. And then that makes me think, well, a lot of people probably think God doesn't deserve to be worshipped, period, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have horrible things happen to them through no fault of their own. We have the whole problem of evil. So yeah, what do you do? Is this a God you can worship? So it'll be interesting to see how they develop this God, who apparently has been tinkering away in the garage for a long time, leaving things, I guess, uncontrolled. If Michael's been able to make inroads with the other angels and kind of set himself up, or we learned over the first half of the season that he kind of set himself up between God and all the other angels, so you couldn't just go see Dad anymore. You had to go see Michael instead. So God's just been letting it happen. Is he aware of this? Does he care? Isn't he omnipotent? If he didn't want this to happen, couldn't he have just stopped it?
Right. Does he fall for it? I mean, come on. Does God fall for this? Come on. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, my assumption, and we'll see if I'm right, is that there's got to be a long game going on, that God has things in motion that his angels do not see because they're such short-sighted, selfish creatures, right? They really don't look past their own nose. And Lucifer's been like that a lot. It doesn't seem to be a Lucifer-specific trait that they're all these real narcissists who can't think about other people, put others before themselves. He's been learning, obviously, and so he has, put his friends sometimes before him when he dies to go to hell to get the formula to save Chloe's life, right? He's asking people to kill him to send him to hell, knowing he might not be able to come back. So he has, on occasion, put himself between his friends and danger and things. So he's been learning, but the other angels are still these narcissistic creeps. But God wants them that way. I mean, why wouldn't you, if you're just going to create this sort of servant race, couldn't they be nicer?
Yeah.
Are you not omnipotent there? I don't know. It doesn't make much sense. Although I guess it's nice in the sense that these aren't like sweet little angels, like touched by an angel kind of angels.
Yeah.
Where everything is so saccharinely sweet and they're so good and loving, and you're like, really?
Yeah. I do like that idea that God's kind of playing a mind game, right? Like to get them to grow up or something like that. I mean, that would work. I think that would work with the story, and I think that would, but ultimately it really would not make sense to have God retire. Like, why now, right? Like, I mean, I guess Lucifer has brought this all on, but it's just an odd thing to think after all these millennia, whatever, that, okay, now's the time God's going to retire. So maybe you're right. That's probably pretty smart.
Well, maybe we'll see. Because then we have season 6, right? Which they have said there'll be 10 episodes, I think, in season 6. I'd have to go back and check to see what they said latest, because they changed their minds on that. It might be only 8, but so we had Mom in season 2, and we had Eve show up in season 4, and then we have Michael show up in season 5A, and now Dad in 5B. So where do we go in season 6? If we've already had God walk on stage, it doesn't seem like there's much else you can do. So
I hate shoot 'em up movies, but a War of the Angels would be pretty, would make sense, right? We tend to assume that the War of the Angels has happened, right? That's our mythology of how Lucifer ends up in hell. But maybe they'll depict it, right? Like, that would be interesting. Could be quite interesting.
Yeah,
and there could be some fatalities from that, for sure.
Yeah. Of course, what is death in this show, too? I mean, basically, we said that if Lucifer dies, he'll just end up in hell and be unable to escape. And it's just the demons who don't have souls, so they would actually die. But I assume that, say, if an angel died who wasn't condemned to hell, then they would just end up in heaven without being able to leave. So,
or do they cease to exist? But I'm guessing humans would be the pawns, right? Like humans are. And of course, Lucifer's one of the few that cares about humans.
Right.
So he's vulnerable now.
We'll have to see if his friends are used against him. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So any final thoughts on ideas of God and Lucifer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm cool with them playing with a lot of different ideas of God. And I'll be honest, it made me think about, it's hard to get up and preach a loving God if you stop and think about it. So, but I really love your idea that God's playing a long game, right? God's trying to make them grow up, or, that's my words in that, but I like that idea. That makes more sense. Right?
Well, also, I think it could pull it off also because Lucifer seemed, and I guess the other angels seem really dense. So you think that if your father was God and just shows up and says, hey, I'm going to retire, your first thought wouldn't be, oh, I'm going to be God. It would be, what is he planning, right? What is the long game here? So that they don't, apparently, at least it's hard to tell from the trailer, seems to be one of those short-sighted things that the angels seem very prone to do in this show.
Yeah.
Okay,
cool.
So if you like this episode of Infernal Intercourse, remember to hit like and subscribe, share it around because that really helps me, and leave us comments. We would like to hear from you.
Yes.
So hit those little notification things and give us your opinion. And on the 28th of May, we'll find out what happens in Season 5B on Lucifer. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.